can't say that I've been looking forward to this one. For those of you who are here for the first time or haven't attended over the last few weeks, we've been doing a Lenten worship series on the 7 deadly sins, which doesn't mean we are worshiping the 7 deadly sins, but worshiping God with an eye to the 7 particular ways we humans can become turned in on ourselves and separate ourselves from one another and from God, which is the effect of sin. Sin separates us from our true selves, from God, and from one another. The 7 deadly sins were developed in the early centuries of the church as a tool for self-examination. And they give us an insightful lens by which we can better see the disorders of the human spirit that hinder our relationship with God and with one another and can frustrate our spiritual growth. That is the point of them. Unless we look honestly and squarely at the areas of sin, of having missed the mark, and the shadows in our lives, we won't be open to the increase of love and light that God is always eager to grant us. So we've looked at the interior shadowlands created by greed and gluttony, anger, sloth, envy. And next week on Palm Sunday, we'll address the queen mother of the deadly sins, pride. But today we have lust. And as I hope you've begun to realize, if you hadn't already, all the sins are present in each of us, if we look hard enough. And since the church is filled with all of us, all the sins are present in the church as well. No need to deny that. But of all the sins, of all the deadly sins, I think this one loomed for me as the one I've been least looking forward to, and I was wondering why exactly that is. And maybe it's simply because of the taboo subject of sex itself. I mean, how many of us feel free to talk about sex openly and freely with even our closest of friends, much less in the church, from the pulpit? Maybe my reluctance has to do with the church's handling of sex across the ages and its reputation for a puritanical, anti-pleasure, anti-body stance on one hand, and a grotesque hypocrisy of church leadership, sickly beset by the sin of lust on the other. Maybe it's because there's some twisted way, and which I cannot for the life of me understand, but some way in which the church's issues with sex has been leveled against our vulnerable gay, lesbian, bisexual, transgendered friends and made them the scapegoat for our confusion around sex and sexual pleasure and the body in general. Or maybe it's how this subject has sat tensely in my own life, being raised within a sex is bad until you're married Baptist culture down south, and the struggle of figuring my own way through it, and how that has intersected with a wife raised in a celibacy is holier than sexuality Catholic culture. I know that's a lot in that sense to lay on you. And that's about as personal as I'm going to get, okay? So don't worry. You don't have to walk out yet. But just, I guess, suffice it to say that it is fraught. And I'm not about to pretend like I can unpack it in the next 10 minutes of this sermon. But for our purposes this Lent, what I can do is to lift up for a moment how this deadly sin infects our hearts and our culture and works insidiously to separate us from our true selves, from true relationships with one another, and from God, God's self. The fact that the church has either chosen not to talk much about it out of discomfort or approached it far too simplistically and superficially in my mind has only meant that I think the church has been sidelined in the conversation and unfortunately has not said enough about how this beautiful human gift from God to us of human sexuality can unfortunately become distorted and deadly in our lives and our culture. So here is something of the shadowland of lust. We can't get around that lust is about sex, sexual pleasure, ourselves as sexual beings. It is a misnomer to say, I'm lusting after that car. Because if it's excessive desire of material things, then we've already established that it would be the sin of greed. It's also a misnomer in the language of the 7 deadly sins to refer to wanderlust or lust for life. If it's a positive thing we are talking about, an embrace of life and a desire that fulfills or drives us towards what is good and right, then it is not a sin, pure and simple. So we cannot say not all lust is bad, because lust is a sin, and by definition, sin is bad. Human sexuality is a beautiful good, but lust is the name for when it goes ugly and bad. So let us count some of these ways, but I promise to end on an affirming note of the beauty of human sexuality. And I believe Jesus himself can get us there. So lust, the deadly sin of lust, distorts the good desire for sexual pleasure and union between people into a distorted desire for self-gratification alone. Sex and sexuality is an expression of love when it is a mutual exchange and gift from self to one another. But it is an expression of lust when it is twisted to satisfy the self at the expense of the other or disregarding the other. The sin has been on display in our culture, especially of late, in all forms of people in power sexually abusing or demeaning the people around them. And I won't here recount the many examples, but I invite you to just take note of the way the sin of lust simmers in our culture and public discourse. And I think it is that men in particular, it seems, are having to watch themselves these days and take note of how their sexuality can be distorted and harmful to women and children in certain instances is only appropriate. The reason it feels oppressive to some, particularly white men in these days, is because for too long their power and lust's relation to it has rarely been challenged and mostly gone unchecked. A good first guideline to contain the spread of the damage that lust can wreak is something our mothers have always told us, keep your hands to yourself. But lust can also exert its ugly shadow in our lives between consensual adults who are giving themselves to one another out of love, even. If and when their sexual desire and engagement with one another overshadows more important goods in their lives. For instance, when a sexual relationship betrays a spousal commitment or devotion to a family, or let's say an affair within a church that blows up a communion of people. If anyone has been in a church where this has happened, you know how damaging this sin can be and far-reaching. Sin turns us in on ourselves and separates us from God and others. And the sin of lust can do the same with a couple, turning them in on themselves and separating them from God and others beyond them, so they're almost blind to anything outside of that couple's relationship. But the long and contorted reach of lust in lives can fester in what seems to be the most private and individual of activities, and that is in the world of sexual fantasy. 12% of all websites, 12% of all websites on the internet are pornographic. 25% of all searches are porn-related. 40 million Americans are regular visitors to pornography sites. 70% of men ages 18 to 24 visit porn in a typical month. The average age of a first-time viewer of pornography is 11. The pornography industry's annual revenue is more than the NFL, the NBA, and the MLB combined. More than the combined revenues of CBS, ABC, and NBC. Pornography, of course, reveals in vivid terms how the sin of lust can lay waste to lives and stand in stark contrast to sex as an expression of love and goodness. That it can damage the heart and soul of a person. Ask any recovering porn addict. That it's not, in fact, a private activity that doesn't hurt anyone. Ask any woman or child who has been trafficked in the $5 billion sex industry. Studies have shown that pornography fosters brutality against women, especially, and a culture of conquest of women by men. The multi-billion-dollar industry that thrives in our towns and country lays waste to relationships and families, and is a particularly ugly face of the deadly sin that roils barbarically beneath the surface of our seemingly civilized culture. For those it holds tight and often hidden in its clutches, it is a harrowing thing to extricate oneself from its clutch. But God's love for us is as true and deep no matter what. We remember that God's grace is larger than the power of pornography and lust. And we hear clearly the invitation to life change and course correction that God constantly invites us into. But it's easy to see the sin of lust in someone who is addicted to pornography, or in someone who has had an affair, for us to say shame, shame, and for sex traffickers as those who make money off of lust's power and human misery. But the question many of us must ask ourselves as we turn this lens on ourselves to avoid the old log in our own eye syndrome is, in sexual matters, what are the ways that we miss the mark? What are the ways that I miss the mark? It is likely that those of us in loving marital relationships who don't indulge in pornography still deal with lust's shadows, even in how we relate to our most intimate of partners. Our sexuality and ourselves as sexual beings, and that those of our partners, can be a minefield where, for a myriad of reasons, the ideal of mutual exchange of love between one and another and the other is distorted. Because of our own hang-ups and struggles in the way we were raised, by our selfishness for what we want and need regardless of the other, by our inability to share vulnerably where we are caught and stuck, the sin of lust can wreak havoc regardless of our marital status, regardless of sexual orientation or gender identity. Are there fantasies that lead us gradually away from the one we have committed our lives to? Has the media set up an ideal of sexuality that has undermined and diminished our own intimate pleasure with our significant other? When was the last time we worked intentionally on our sexual relationship with our partners to keep things alive and fresh? Has the sin of lust been visited upon our lives in our past in whatever form that curtails our own sexual pleasure and freedom? Is there shame or embarrassment or anger connected to sex that we can't even talk about with the ones closest to us because it runs so deep and murky inside of us? Lust, maybe more than any other deadly sin, can cut to the core of who we are and how we see ourselves, and then shame us into not talking about it with anyone. The question in the end is, how does the beautiful and wonderful good of human sexuality become distorted in our hearts and in our culture, such that something that is supposed to connect us instead separates us? Something that is supposed to involve the deep honoring of one another instead degrades the other. Something that is supposed to initiate and create life instead poisons life. Something that is supposed to increase love somehow tragically transmits pain. It is so fraught. I took the title of my sermon from the writer Frederick Buechner, who said this about sex. It's like nitroglycerin. It can be used either to blow up bridges or to heal hearts. The sin of lust uses sex to blow up bridges all over the place, but our sexuality, our sexual pleasure can also heal hearts. We can engage our sexuality and sensuality for love so that it becomes a primary way that we can taste heaven in the here and now. We have a whole book in our Bible, the Song of Songs, that is based upon that. It is kept in the Bible, even though it is a love poem, erotic at times, sensual love poem between two people. But it's maintained in our Bible because the Jews had a very clear sense that that was a pathway to God, maybe one of the biggest. And it only makes sense that in our Christian theology we take into account and praise God and celebrate the beauty of human sexuality because it is a body-embracing, not a body-denying theology, no matter what we've been taught across the ages. We say God incarnated in human form and became Jesus because God so loved the world. And note that it doesn't say, except that gross, embarrassing sex stuff, right? Jesus didn't have any of that. We don't know what Jesus did with his sexuality and his capacity to experience sexual pleasure and his attraction to women or men. We don't know. It's crazy how it almost sounds sacrilegious to speak of Jesus as a sexual being who must have at least desired sexual pleasure, if not indulged in it at times. But it's more crazy, I think, for us to claim that he was fully human, had all the struggles and temptations and beauties of being human, except in that area. I mean, talk about disconnecting us from Jesus. We say he was without sin, which the church has unfortunately too often equated with his being nearly without sex. Although there have been some bold scholars across the ages who have suggested that Jesus had a thing for Mary Magdalene and she a thing for him, who knows? But that the Christian faith should be body-honoring, sex is beautiful, affirming faith tradition, there seems little doubt to me. And it seems the scripture and the sacrament we have this morning offer beautiful counterpoints to the sin of lust. Mary, this is not Mary Magdalene, although that's often how it's interpreted, but the scripture we have is of another Mary who breaks pure nard perfume over Jesus' feet and wipes her hair, wipes his feet with her hair. It's a beautiful glimpse of the holiness of bodily love given from Mary to Jesus for the expressed purpose. For the expressed purpose, it does say that she did this to prepare him for his death and burial, but undoubtedly it is an act packed with the power of sexuality, the intimacy and sensuality of it, and it makes everyone in the room really, really uncomfortable. It sets Judas off to jabbering about the perfume should have been sold and given to the poor. And Jesus loved what she did. I mean, who wouldn't? This beautiful bodily expression of love and care, affirming Jesus and the path he was to take. We know somehow that her act is in no way tainted by the sin of lust, but has a purity of intention and love that makes it a thing of beauty. If you've ever made love to someone who is departing for a while, or as an expression of coming back together after a great fight, or across some kind of other threshold, then you know how powerful and beautiful the body-given act for coming together can be. And then there's Jesus himself offering his body to the world as a sacrifice on the cross, which gives us the gift of communion. Both of these acts, from Mary to Jesus and from Jesus to the world, are the polar opposite of the sin of lust. The sin of lust, which leads us to take another's body for our own pleasure or turn us in on ourselves. Instead, Jesus suffers the horrible bodily pain of crucifixion and gives his body to us for our good and our pleasure. He doesn't turn in on himself, but turns outward towards the world, and by receiving him into ourselves, we are united with him. We are newly conceived and reborn. We are affirmed in love, and we then turn outwards towards others in the multiplying effect of love. This act of communion can be seen as an antidote to the sin of lust, a practice in how we give ourselves to one another, because we don't come to this table and grab what we want of Jesus for our own gratification with no account of anyone else. Rather, we approach this beautiful body with an abiding and grateful sense of how it has been given to us in love, with the understanding that we too make ourselves vulnerable in the receiving of it, and then the giving of ourselves in response. And even if just for a moment we receive God's love in that act, which is what we are seeking ultimately in it all, God's love into our bodies, into our psyches, into our souls, and for a moment all is made well. All manner of thing shall be well. Amen.